29th of August, 1940. Low cloud over stubble fields. Margaret Ellison kneels by a hedge with a hooded torch and a folded map. She is an engineer for the Ministry of Aircraft Production, sent to place a decoy site. She lays a line of test lamps along the furrows, counts her paces, and ties a ribbon to the wire to read the wind. The lights must look like a working airfield and a busy roofline when seen from a bomber at height, so she shields each bulb and checks the angles twice. The bomber routes press toward Coventry and Birmingham, so this field must pull them aside. If she gets the distances right, bombs will fall on empty ground and not on machine shops. If she is careless, the real plants will glow in the next flare path. She works fast because dusk comes early under cloud, and because a stray gleam, seen from above or by a patrol, could end the ruse before it starts. On the 16th of July, 1940, a stack of aerial photographs lay on a steel table, edges curled from damp. Margaret Ellison traced a river bend with a pencil and marked a tight fan of rail lines with a dot. She was an engineer for the Ministry of Aircraft Production, given a brief that fit inside one sentence and touched everything. Keep the dispersed aircraft sheds working by pairing each with a nearby decoy that would draw bombs away. The sheds were spread across the Midlands in small groups, hidden in plain sight in market towns and old mills, because the big plants drew too much fire. Her task was to lay false patterns around them so the picture from the sky led bombers wrong. She studied the Luftwaffe's own habits in the photos and in notes pushed across to her from the reconnaissance desks. Aiming points showed as logic on paper: a junction where four rails met, a kink in a canal, a block of roof shapes set square to a road. Crews would come in high, pick a shape they had learned by rote, and run a line through it. Therefore her decoy had to sit where that line could fall early and seem right. The maps told her more than landmarks. Contour lines showed how smoke would hold or slide. Field shapes showed who might be watching from a gate. She penciled circles around sites where a false roof line could sit close to a real one and not give it away. She looked for marginal land downwind of towns, poor fields that lay low and took water. Smoke and glow must drift away from homes and away from the real sheds. If a fire blew back over a town, it would catch eyes and point the enemy's gaze to the wrong truth. It would also bring villagers out with buckets and talk. She tapped the wind rose she kept folded into her map case and checked it against the last week's reports. In her notes, she wrote simple tests. A hedgerow should break the view from the lane. A belt of trees should let a glow show to a cockpit but not to a farmhouse window. A ditch line should carry cables without a telltale ridge. By day she visited farms along narrow lanes under a cover story of civil surveying. In farm kitchens, she asked to see a boundary deed or a tithe map so she could note who owned which corner. She carried letters from the electricity board as well as from her ministry, so the asks felt routine. Permission to lay a buried feed across a field to a small hut. Agreement to keep a gate unlocked on odd nights. No talk beyond the kitchen table. The real job sat inside those plain steps. Without a quiet power line, there would be no signal at all. Without access, her crew would stumble in hedges and leave marks. When the supply men came, she stood with them in the lane and nodded when they chose a route that would put the cable deep and the jointers pit out of sight. She kept her watch set to the shift whistles at the real sheds and wrote down start and stop times. Lights must move in the sky when workers moved below, or else a pilot would see the trick. Therefore she drew a timetable for the decoy that matched the factory's pulse. A row of roof-light glows raised at clock-in and lowered at tea break. A scatter of yard lamps that blinked when carts should be moving. A flare line that came up when a weld shop would be open. On tracing paper, she worked up patterns of taxiways and roof-light clusters that matched what a camera might capture at height. She refused roads. A road would bring sightseers, and sightseers would bring talk. The pattern had to live only in light and shadow. For shape she used timber and canvas. She ordered mock sheds to the scale of an adult's stride, set where the moon would make their edges red as mass. She checked the almanac and drew arrows for expected moon angles week by week. The silhouettes were the point. Night crews often flew by outline and brightness, not by detail, because there was no time for detail. So she told the carpenters to keep faces flat and corners sharp, and she told the painters to set long dark strips on the canvas to suggest skylights. A hangar-sized body with a lighter band could sell the lie from 2,000 feet, and that was enough. Fire needed rules. To read as industry, a site had to offer the warm glow of fuel and work. But fire could not run loose. She wrote a safety plan that ringed every oil tray with bare earth, cut to mineral soil so flame could lap and not climb. She had the spades and picks listed by size and count, and the sand buckets stacked in the switch hut. She asked a local to borrow a water cart that could reach a hedge in minutes. The plan was plain. The glow would be coaxed, not fed. The line between a decoy and a blaze was thin, and she meant to sit on it. At dusk on test nights, she stood at the switch hut and counted. She used a hand lamp with a red filter to check the faces of the control dials, then shut it off to let her eyes hold the dark. When the feed came alive, the bulbs rose in steps, not all at once, because a pulse looked truer than a flood. She walked the field edge and looked back to see if a hedge top caught stray light. If it did, she made a note and had the shield narrowed. She put a runner by the lane with instructions to stop any walker with a simple line about a cable fault ahead, because a person on a gate could be another kind of light. None of this was told at home. She signed secrecy papers that grew stricter as the work grew. The cover story was fixed in her pocket: civil survey work, drainage and line checks, no reason to ask more. She burned drafts in the office stove and kept only a small pocket book with codes for sites and times. In that book, she wrote a line she did not show to anyone. If the decoy worked too well, she and her crew would stand inside the aim point. Therefore she chose shallow slit trenches near the switch hut and marked a path to a lower field where the ground folded. She hoped never to run it, but the line on her map was there, sharp as a pencil mark and as real. She pressed crushed chalk into a pale loop around the site, a line wide as a cart track. Under starlight it would read as a runway edge or the border of a factory yard. She chose chalk because it held a soft glow even when the lamps were out, so a crew looking down between cloud holes would still see a plan. She set the curves to match what a camera would see at height, not what a walker would see at the hedge. When rain threatened to smudge the line, she had sacks ready and set a rake in the switch hut to pull the edge back true. She chose gaps where a tractor could cross without leaving wheel marks that would read as a clue. She built a dummy light array on stakes, each wrapped in black hessian with a slit, all tied back to a small board with dimmer levers. 3 circuits sat under her hand, a slow pulse run for taxiing, a steady smear for roof glow, and a low redder wash to suggest furnace glare. She tested height with a yard stick and adjusted stake lengths so the lamps sat as if at different building eaves. Wires ran through a ditch and up to the board, and each join sat under a tin that she stuffed with rag to keep sparks in. She kept a paper card with marks where the levers should sit at different hours. A sudden flood of light would look false, so she set the dimmers to rise in steps, because steps felt like people moving. For heat she chose shallow oil trays and coke braziers, not open flame. She cut sheet metal into pans, filled them with sand, and poured waste oil through until the sand held a slow burn. She stacked coke in small stoves and used a hand bellows to bring them to a dull red. The glow stayed low and wide, and the air moved it into a smear. That was the look she wanted. She set the trays on bare soil she had scraped the week before and ringed each with a coil of wire, so a foot would find the edge by touch. She kept a marked stick to measure the height of the heat shimmer from the ground, because a plume meant risk. In wind she turned the braziers so vents faced leeward, so sparks would not carry to the hedge. She had the carpenters stretch canvas panels across timbers, and she painted them with false skylights and soft shadow bands. She used chalk wash, soot, and stove black, and she fixed a rule: no hard lines where a camera would expect a gradient. She lifted each panel at a shallow angle so moonlight could find the painted light wells. A photograph from height would see a pattern of rectangles and dull bands, and place a roof where there was none. For fine glints, she tested strips of reflective sheeting under netting so small points of light would show without a clear beam. She sewed the sheeting in irregular patches and chose mesh with a wide weave so the glints would break up. When she stood back from the hedge, she looked for any point that flashed like a signal and shifted the net until it scattered. She had plywood cut to the outlines of small aircraft sections and set them near flat crates like lids on machine tools. From the air, the shells and boxes would read as parts queues and work in progress outside a shed. She refused neat rows. Real yards were never neat. She told the crew to keep gaps uneven and to move 2 or 3 pieces between test nights so the layout changed as if men had been working. She stenciled numbers on some crate tops in a blur, then scuffed them with a boot to soften the edges, because sharp marks could look drawn. The control table sat inside a straw-covered hut built to the profile of a small rick. Inside, she placed the board, a sand pail, and a small stool, and cut a narrow slit facing west. Through it she watched the sky and counted the seconds between engine notes. The count told her when a formation was closing and how far. She wrote those counts on the same card as the dimmer marks. She rehearsed a timed script for the lights that keyed to the local siren codes and to radar plot messages carried by a runner from the nearest post. No radio sat in the hut. Radios gave off a trace, and a trace could draw a finder. When the runner came with a word from the post, diver or raider or all clear, she shifted the levers to the next mark without speaking. To complete the picture, she drew fake rail spurs with tar and ash. She measured ties at the right spacing with a strip of lath cut to a gauge, then laid narrow black lines and set shorter cross marks to suggest sleepers. Ash dulled the tar so it would not shine. She led the spur off the lane at a shallow angle and let it vanish behind a hedge where a real cut would pass. In day, the marks looked like a farmer's mess from ditch work. At height, at night, the geometry sat right. A constable once paused at the lane and watched her men working the brush. She held her civil survey paper and spoke about drainage marks and boundary checks, then waited for him to nod and move on. When rain came, she sent the youngest man to reset the ash, because if the ties blurred, the trick would not stand. She trained a small crew of volunteers from a nearby yard. They learned silent hand signals. Palm open for pause, fist for off, 2 fingers for half-light. She ran them through sand bucket drills until they could smother a tray in 3 moves. She made the blackout rule plain. If pathfinders circled, every lamp died, every tray got a lid, and the hut door shut with the board covered by a blanket. On a late night when white flares hung for a breath over the fields to the north, she raised her hand, and the sight went dark in 1 beat. They stood with their hands on the straw and counted. The engine notes came, the seconds closed, and then the dull weight of bombs fell well wide, a thud and a wash of air that rattled the hut and lifted loose straw like dust. When it passed, she let them light 1 lamp to check for embers, and they found none. After that night, she adjusted the chalk loop where bomb fragments had lifted it and set the stakes deeper on the west edge. She changed the light script to cut sooner when the siren code rose, because the flares had come faster than the runner. She went to the radar post the next day and asked for a shorter line of hand messages so her man could carry fewer words and lose less time on the lane. She wrote the change in her pocketbook in cipher and burned the draft in the office stove. She signed for more oil and sent for more ash from the gasworks, because both would be needed. By the next test run, the pattern held smoother. The chalk read under thin cloud, the glint stayed small and scattered, and the low red wash sat where a furnace hall would sit on a plan. She watched from the slit and counted the seconds again. That count settled in her like a metronome, a way to know what might come through the dark. She did not speak about it at home. She turned her card over and wrote down only the marks that mattered, which lever, which second, which hand sign. The rest stayed in the field, in the straw and the chalk, where it could work and not be seen. On the 14th of November 1940, word reached her by runner that a heavy raid was plotted toward Coventry. She brought her crew to stations and kept only the 2 guide lamps hooded and low. The hut smelled of oil and damp straw. She checked the wind with a ribbon at the slit and felt a slow drift to the east, so smoke would carry away from the lane. She rested her fingers on the dimmer levers and would not move them yet. A premature flood would look like a stage and not a yard, and crews trained to spot neatness. She stood still and waited for the engine hum to swell enough to vibrate the board under her hand. When the sound thickened and grew steady, she eased the first taxiway glows up a notch, then another, so the effect rose as if men were walking a line of switches. Looking west, she picked out the river bend by its dark void and saw the main stream offset north of it. Therefore she shifted her plan and brought the roof light grid up on the north side first in steps to catch that angle. The rectangles she had painted on canvas answered one by one, low and warm, and the small mirror patches under netting returned tiny broken glints. From height that would read as a busy roof run, she kept the perimeter chalk loop dark so nothing would look too clean. The first incendiaries fell short with a peppering hiss in the wet grass, and then one found a hedge and took. Flame climbed until it snatched dry stalks she had missed and started to crackle. She judged it at a glance and chose to hold the light pattern steady, because a sudden blackout would send the bomb line hunting. She sent the youngest man with a spade at a run to ring the base with soil. The week before she had cut that hedge back to mineral earth for just this reason, so the ring took fast and the flame settled to a low edge. She kept her eyes on the levers and counted her breaths to hold the cadence. A stick of high explosive began to walk in from the west, each blast a flat punch that pulled at the chest and set straw to lift and fall. She saw the line in it, measured by the seconds between, and knew the last two might bracket the hut. Because of that, she moved the crew to the shallow scrape they had dug that afternoon, a step down in the soil with its lip toward the lane. They lay with hands on the dimmers, elbows in grit, and kept the levers where she had set them. When the near one went, the hut wall flexed and the lamp cords hummed. One circuit flickered. She pushed the lever a half-point higher until the glow steadied again. The ground gave off the iron smell that comes when fresh earth is torn. A white flare dropped close and stuck hissing inside the decoy fence, bright as a small sun. She squinted through the slit and saw how the next ranks of engines changed tone and cut in on it, as taught. She held the roof light grid even and let the taxiway line breathe once more to seem alive. The chalk loop was lit like a rail bed now, and bombs began to fall across it in a tidy march that missed the real assembly sheds downwind. She could not see those sheds from where she lay, but in her head she placed them against the map, felt their distance, and knew why the levers had to stay where they were. At the east corner, a tray flared too high and spat. One of the volunteers went to it on his knees and smothered with a lid the way she had drilled. He caught the rim wrong, lifted too soon, and a tongue took his wrist. He jerked back and clamped his jaw shut and stuffed the hand in the water pail, then wrapped it with damp rag torn from a sack. She saw the shake in his shoulder and weighed the pull to cut the whole sight and get him away against the calculus she had set from the first brief. If the pattern broke now, the stick would creep toward town. Because the first wave was still passing, and because the flare still sat inside their fence, she chose to hold. She sent another man to take the lid and the burned one to the scrape to press wet cloth under his sleeve and keep the hand higher than his heart. A lone bomber began to circle as if sniffing for runway markers, wide and slow, finding the chalk and the guide lamps and then failing to lock. She read the orbit and cut the perimeter in a fast sequence, north to west to south, the way a damaged plant would kill its fence lights under an order. The bomber drifted off a fraction, uncertain, and then slid on to the next glow in the distance. The town sirens shifted to the long rise that marked an all-clear for the first phase, so she dropped every circuit to dark in one sweep, counted 20, and then raised a low, broken repair wash near the false yard. A late formation came high and loose, wavered on the edge of that smear, and bent toward it. She felt the wrongness of lighting again after a near miss, but the map in her head set cause against effect. The washed light would look like men working to keep a line open, and that was the bait. When the hum went thin and then fell away to the north, She shut the board and stepped out. The air carried the sharp smell of magnesium and oil and the damp sweetness of crushed roots. She walked the ground as dawn came, chalk white under her boots and earth black in the craters. She counted holes and marked shrapnel finds with a boot heel, then wrote the numbers in her pocket book with stiff fingers. Canvas panels lay ripped, and a timber brace had a piece of casing buried in it like a coin. The mirror patches under mesh were torn but still held tiny dull glints along their edges. She sent a note by cyclist to the shed she paired to this field. The reply came back near breakfast, near misses and broken glass. A door off its hinge, no stoppage at the assembly lines. She made a calm list of repairs on a fresh card: new stakes for the north run, a replacement lid for the tray that spat, deeper trench for the lamp feed that hummed at blast. Cut back the mist hedge stretched to clean soil. She marked the burned wrist in her ledger by number and left a blank space for the man's name when censors allowed it. The meaning of the night sat plain without words. A flare in the wrong field had turned a weight of steel away from a true yard. The crew would sleep, the sheds would turn their shifts, and the lesson would fold into the next map she drew. By first light she stood over a new set of plots pinned to a board. The sector map showed last night's fall records for the region in small neat marks. They ran thick over the field she had dressed with chalk, canvas, and low heat, then thin to almost nothing across the roofs that held the true assembly lines. She put a finger to the gap and traced it along the rail kink she had used as a lure. The space over the real yards was not luck to her. It was the curve of approach she had drawn with light and smoke. That curve had held even as the wind shifted. At the office she asked for the weekly stoppage tallies and read them standing at the window. Minutes lost to broken glazing and a downed line were counted in tens, not hundreds. The machine shop had held its shifts. The engine test bays had stayed powered. The tally carry over to the month meant the quota could stand. A thin file in the in-tray held an internal note that spoke in flat terms about an effective dummy site in her sector and a measurable diversion of bombs. There were no names, only a code and a grid. She put it aside and made a list of repairs. A lamp feed that hummed under blast, a west run with loose stakes, oil trays to reline. On the second night after, she went back with her crew and cut the board wiring clean and re-terminated every run. She reset the oil in the trays to a thinner layer and shifted them a few paces so their glow sat further off the false roof line. Her counts from the raid had shown faster approach speeds on the second wave, which meant the step-ups in light had been too slow. She wrote a new drill sheet in pencil with shorter intervals and a different order. Roof grid first when the river bend red dark, yard wash later, guide lamps last and brief. She pinned the sheet inside the hut with a map tack and ran the sequence twice by the watch until the levers fell to hand without thought. The next morning she took out the dispersal list she kept folded into her case and made changes that followed the night's proof. She moved a set of wing ribs to a shed she had walked on the far edge of a hamlet where the land held a fold, and she shifted machined spars to a mill that had a belt of poplars for cover. If a single line went down, these placements would keep subassemblies flowing. She marked the changes as plain grid references without names and sent them to the ministry courier. The effect would not show on any one day, but when the month closed, no single hit could take a wing off the books. She went to see the burned volunteer at the small hospital up the road. His wrist sat under a pale bandage that climbed past his cuff. He greeted her with a nod and looked past her to the window where the bare branches crossed the light. She wrote the injury into her log by his crew number, not a full name, and left a space for the date of return. The rule was hard and plain. Even secret work needed a paper trail that could be audited inside the fence, and the paper could not leak beyond it. She walked back with the smell of carbolic in her clothes and added one more lid to the tray list when she reached the office. A security clerk brought her a typed instruction and a small tin. She was to copy coordinates from her field sketches and then burn the drawings to clean ash. She laid her tracing paper on the board, wrote each grid mark into her notebook, and watched the lines she had made, the chalk loops, the canvas rectangles, the dummy spur angles, curl and turn black inside the tin. The record that remained was only numbers and short words. She signed the new secrecy reminder and put it with the others in her file. At home, she said her usual line about survey checks and electric works and hung her coat to hide the small scorches near the cuff. The acts that had saved a yard were not hers to share. The work went on within those bounds, night to night and then year to year, until the files were sealed and put down. After the war, she moved on to other drawings and other brief words, and the thick envelopes about the dummy field stayed closed in storage. It was roughly half a century before the papers opened. She read about it on a library board and then asked to see the maps. The sheets came out with a smell like old paste. Her sites were marked as dots beside farm lanes with small codes and no names. She traced a finger along a lane she remembered for its camber, and knew the dot as if the chalk were still under her boots. A short article in a magazine said some of the decoy crews were now being named. She looked for her grid and did not see it listed, but the totals for the protected plants were printed in clear numbers. The engine shop she had shielded showed its wartime output at last, month by month, and then in a tall line across the years. In those bars, she could read her night work as a steady band that never broke. The bomb plots she had once stood over with a pencil were now public prints on a page, and the gap she had traced over roofs was there to see. What remained for her were the counts and the turns, and the way a hand can hold a lever steady when the ground lifts under it. The false roofs were long gone, the chalk washed out, the fields plowed back to furrow and seed. The sheds that had stayed lit made airframes and engines that flew where they were sent, and the effect of that ran far past the town lanes she knew. Her own name stayed off the lists, but the lines that mattered lived on in the way the output held pace and turned a hard year into one that could be stood. She returns to the field in her mind and can still place the shallow craters and the darker patch of soil where the trays once glowed. The hedge has grown back and hides the lane she watched for footsteps. The real plants survived crucial nights because bombs fell on empty ground she arranged, and the lines kept moving when they needed to. Her log stays plain and spare, the habit of not speaking lasting as long as the seal on the files, and even after the papers opened, she kept to short notes and the counts that had guided her hand. In the public prints, she once saw the engine shop's output run steady across the hard months, and recognized the gap she had drawn with smoke and light without putting her name to it. What remains is simple. A small deception, run well under risk, can shield machines and people far beyond the field itself, and her unseen choices folded into the national ledger that kept production standing.